It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
Here's Trump telling the press that the war started because Biden said that Ukraine could join NATO. That's why Keir Starmer is so very smart in making sure that the world knows that Ukraine will inevitably join NATO. What a smart guy. Here's Trump saying that Biden escalated this conflict.
Yesterday were pretty accurate. I don't see any way that a country in Russia's position could allow them, just in their position, could allow them to join NATO. I don't see that happening. And long before President Putin, Russia was very strong on the fact that I believe that's the reason the war started. Because Biden went out and said that they could join NATO, and he shouldn't have said that. As soon as he said that, I said, you know what? You're going to have a war now, and I was right about that.
I was right about that.
This is a war that would have never happened if I were president.
But you don't think it's President Biden's fault, not President Putin? I mean, he's the one.
I think Biden is incompetent, and I think when he said that they could join NATO, I thought that was a very stupid thing to say. I thought when he said, well, it depends if it's a minor incursion. In other words, it's okay if Russia does a minor incursion. I thought that was a very foolish thing to say.
There you go. More of that plain speaking. I think the supporters of President Trump really love and admire. Here's a compilation that suggests that Ukraine's membership of NATO could have been provocative and a factor in the escalation of this conflict.
President Putin actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders.
Flashback.
This is fundamentally not about NATO expansion.
It was never about NATO enlargement.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO expanding toward Russia.
This was never about NATO.
We don't talk about NATO, no. We don't talk about NATO. There was a verbal agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan. What?
It's absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansionism.
And it has nothing to do with NATO.
This is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not really about NATO.
This is not about NATO.
This is about NATO.
Seriously, it's not about NATO.
This was never about NATO.
It was never about NATO. Let's be honest.
It's like everyone in the world you can't trust lining up to tell you that this isn't about NATO.
This doesn't have anything to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO at all.
Yeah, he's claiming it's like security purposes, but we can see the clear reason.
But NATO is not the reason.
This is not about NATO expansion. This is about the democratic expansion.
Ukraine bans religious organizations.
We are protecting democracy right now.
Ukraine is banning political parties.
Because it's a democracy.
Ukraine restricts books and music.
It's about democracy.
Ukraine won't hold elections.
It's about democracy.
And it's not about NATO expansion.
This war in Ukraine is not about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
That's not about NATO.
It has nothing to do with NATO.
Nothing to do with NATO expansion.
That guy was actually in our other studio. That guy. You go back a couple of seconds. Can you get back a couple of seconds on that? Or can I?
It has nothing to do with NATO.
There's a guy. He was in like our other studio, man. Check him out.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It was not about NATO. NATO is just as a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere.
It's not about NATO expansion.
Nothing to do with NATO.
It isn't really about NATO.
It's not about NATO.
It's not about NATO enlargement. In fact, it has nothing to do with NATO.
It's not about NATO encroaching.
It was not about NATO. NATO is just as a fictitious, imaginary adversary for Mr. Putin and for Russia.
It was never about NATO.
That's not what it's been about. It's been about him trying to expand his sphere of influence.
Hang on, I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive. Obviously, Russia has wished for a sphere of influence over Ukraine, but if the West had not challenged Russian interests so directly, I think that there was a chance to avoid this war.
He wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. We rejected that.
The reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because of his evil.
Evil.
It's about that Putin wants to rebuild Soviet empire of evil, like President Reagan told.
It's about Putin being sick.
I don't know how you negotiate peace with a madman, but
Nobody negotiated with Hitler.
People are comparing him to Hitler.
And remember Hitler.
He's a Hitler.
We're back when the Nazis invaded Poland.
This is exactly the same what Hitler was doing to Jews.
This is the same. Putin will not stop.
Putin is reminiscent of Hitler.
Hitler.
This reminds me of Hitler.
Hitler.
He's the new Hitler.
Who Hitler?
This is about a butcher trying to kill people everywhere in the world, just not Ukraine, Syria, all over the place.
Oh, the game's up when it comes to filthy propaganda. We can see in real time how their flailing false narratives are exposed. What a transformation it is to see peripheral narratives and peripheral figures moving to the centre and telling the truth there. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments and the chat? According to Dr. John Lake, the world-renowned Beverly Hills beauty expert, most wrinkle fixes on the market are nothing but glorified moisturisers. Moisturisers, but glorified. Can you imagine? They hardly make a dent on your appearance, and some could even be harmful, he said. That's why he wants to take your attention away from mainstream cosmetic practices and draw you towards this extraordinary new product. There's a 2-minute video that we want you to watch. It's a viral video that's had millions of views and much positive feedback that alludes to, draws attention to, and helps us to analyse and scrutinise a new wrinkle cream that's powerful and effective. So to learn more about this extraordinary new product that's been called Photoshop for your face and better than any other moisturiser, go right now to bhmd1.com/brand or click the link in the description below. That's bhmd1.com/brand. Click on the link in the description below. Surely all of us want to embalm the cadaver before we even die and look glorious while we're still here on this bandwidth. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to see more uncensored content where free speech can flourish, join our live stream. Click the link right here to watch the next video if you want to, or become a member of a growing movement. Download the Rumble app and you'll be informed every time we make a new piece of content. Stay free.